All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know the drill. You pick the fascinating source material, and we kind of take you on a guided tour of the highlights. And yeah, hope you walk away just a bit smarter on the topic.
Yeah, always a fun challenge.
And this one, you really dug deep for us today.
Yeah, I was excited about this one when you suggested it. Peter Drucker, really a legend in the world of management thinking.
Managing in a time of great change.
Yep, that's the one. And I think, honestly, it's even more relevant now than when it was first published back in the 90s, The world's changing so fast, even faster than back then, probably. And a lot of the core themes in the book, they're still playing out in new ways.
Definitely. And you sent over like a mountain of chapters. I'm not even sure I could list them all off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, we've got, the whole thing about the theory of the business, which is kind of foundational. Planning for uncertainty, which is, always relevant, right? Drucker talks about those sort of like deadly business sins to avoid, which is just a really catchy way to frame those classic pitfalls.
Yeah, I remember seeing that on like those inspirational posters in corporate offices back in the day.
Exactly. Then he gets into the unique challenges of family businesses, which I know is going to resonate with a lot of our listeners. And there's some great stuff on leadership, like these sort of 6 rules for presidents that he lays out, which, you can apply those to any leadership role, really.
And then we get to, it gets really futuristic almost. He's talking about this network society, the information-based organization, which now seems so obvious, right? But back then, it was really ahead of the curve stuff.
Definitely. And then, we wrap up with his insights on the global economy, which I think are more, maybe especially relevant now with all the trade wars and, kind of the shifting dynamics on the global stage.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today, like a guided tour through some of the big ideas from Drucker that I think will be, super useful to listeners no matter what their kind of, background or industry is.
Exactly. Like a cheat sheet, right? We do the deep dive so you don't have to.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The theory of the business. What exactly is Drucker getting at with this term?
Yeah, so the theory of the business, in a nutshell, it's basically the set of assumptions that every company has about its markets, its customers, its competitors, the technologies that it's using, and, most importantly, its own strengths, what it actually gets paid to do.
So it's kind of like a company's DNA, but for its strategy, right? Like you don't always see it, but it's there driving everything.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And what's really interesting is that Drucker points out that most companies haven't really, sat down and actually written this theory down.
Right. It's kind of like the air they breathe. It's just how they operate.
Exactly. And sometimes that works, especially if you're in a stable environment and your assumptions are still valid. But then you get these cases where a company's theory becomes outdated or just plain wrong.
And that's when things start to go south.
Yeah, and he's got some really, almost like cautionary tales from some really big name companies like General Motors and IBM.
Okay, so let's get into those. These are companies that were like giants in their industries. Like how do you screw that up?
Well, so like with IBM, it was this assumption that they had that a computer is a computer. Like back in the 50s, they were the kings of mainframes.
Right, big, huge machines taking up entire rooms.
Exactly, and that worked for a long time. But then, along comes the personal computer in the late 70s, early 80s, and it's a totally different animal.
Right, like suddenly everyone can have a computer on their desk.
Yeah, and IBM, they couldn't wrap their heads around it. They kept thinking of PCs as like little toys, almost, not a serious threat to their mainframe business.
And that just seems so crazy now looking back.
It does, right? But that's what happens when you get stuck in your old way of thinking.
Okay, so IBM, they missed the PC revolution. What about GM? What was their blind spot?
So GM, their theory was all about, the US car market. And it was based on this idea that it was basically like homogenous, like everyone wanted the same kind of car, just at different price points.
Right. So they were all about like, those big sedans, and they had like a ladder of models. You start with the Chevy, then you move up to the Buick, and eventually you end up with a Cadillac.
Exactly. And their whole model was based on trading values. Like you'd buy a new car, drive it for a few years, trade it in for the next model up.
Yeah, like it was a very predictable, like almost a closed system.
Yeah. And it worked great for them for decades. But then you get, the Japanese car makers coming in the 70s and 80s, and they're offering like smaller, more fuel efficient cars, and suddenly the American consumer has like more choice.
Right. And GM, that they're just stuck in their old ways. Like they can't adapt fast enough.
Exactly. And then you get, even within the US, you get things like the minivan, which Chrysler comes out with, and it's this huge unexpected success.
Right. It's not even on GM's radar. They don't even see that market developing.
Yeah. And what Drucker is saying is that these kinds of unexpected successes or even failures, they're warning signs that your theory of the business might need some serious rethinking.
Right? Like the world is changing around you, and you better pay attention.
Yeah. He's basically saying, don't be afraid to challenge your assumptions. Like the most successful companies, they're the ones that are constantly testing their core beliefs about how the world works.
Okay, so that kind of leads us into the next big theme, which is planning for uncertainty. I mean, if the world is changing so fast and you can't even predict, what's going to happen next, how do you even plan?
Right. And Drucker, I mean, he's very upfront about the fact that the future is inherently unpredictable.
Right, like crystal balls don't work.
They really don't. But what he says is that even though you can't control the future, you can make decisions in the present that will shape it.
Right, so it's more about like being prepared for different scenarios, being adaptable.
Exactly. And he points to some examples that, I mean, at the time must have seemed like pretty far out there. Well, like he talks about the rise of mainland China, which back then, I mean, it was still a relatively, closed economy. And he says that it's going to become a major force in the global economy.
And he was right about that. I mean, big time.
Huge. And then he talks about the information revolution, which again, back then the internet was still in its infancy, really.
Right. Like most people were still using dial-up modems.
Exactly. But he could already see that this was going to be a massive change and that it would affect, everything, even things like accounting, which you wouldn't necessarily think of as being, cutting edge.
Right. Like very traditional.
But information changes everything.
Okay. So Drucker's saying that you got to be prepared for change. You got to be adaptable. But how does that actually play out in terms of like, how companies are structured, how they operate?
Well, one of the things he talks about is the shift away from traditional models of growth.
Like what? Like mergers and acquisitions?
Yeah, or even organic growth where you just, you keep doing what you're doing, but you do more of it.
Right, like you open more stores or you hire more salespeople.
Exactly. He's saying that in this new, more uncertain world, those models are not going to be as effective.
So what does he propose instead?
Well, he talks a lot about alliances, joint ventures, what he calls dangerous liaisons.
Dangerous liaisons. That sounds like kind of risky.
Yeah, well, he's not saying it's easy, but he's saying that in a world where things are changing so fast, you can't do everything yourself. You need to be able to partner with other companies, even competitors sometimes, to access new markets, new technologies, new ideas.
Right, like you got to be more collaborative, more flexible.
Exactly. And then internally within companies, he's seeing this trend towards flatter organizational structure.
Like fewer layers of management.
Yeah, fewer layers, more empowered employees, more focus on customer satisfaction.
So it's almost like the hierarchy is breaking down.
In a way, yeah, he's seeing this shift towards organizations that are more nimble, more responsive to change.
And what about like individual employees? How does this affect them?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Drucker, he's basically saying that the days of the job for life are over.
Right, like that old model where you work for the same company for 40 years and then retire with a gold watch.
Exactly. He's saying that's gone. He's saying that in this new world, you have to be responsible for your own career development.
Right. Like you got to be constantly learning, upskilling.
Absolutely. You're basically your own free agent, and you have to be able to market yourself. You have to be able to adapt to changing circumstances.
So it's almost like the individual is becoming more like an entrepreneur.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And he's not saying it's easy, but he's saying it's the reality of the modern world.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of constant change. You got to be adaptable. You got to be responsible for your own career. Now let's talk about like how to actually like succeed in this environment.
Mm-hmm.
And Drucker, he's got this this list of what he calls 5 deadly business sins, like sins, right?
Yeah, it's a really great way to frame it because, like sins are they're things you do that are going to lead to bad outcomes.
Like, you eat that extra slice of cake, you're going to regret it later.
Exactly. And in business, these sins, they can really kill you.
Okay, so what's the first deadly sin?
Well, the first one is pricing a product for what the market will bear.
Okay, but isn't that just good business sense? Like, charge as much as you can, right?
Well, that's the traditional thinking, but Drucker's saying that in a rapidly changing market, that can actually be really dangerous
Oh, so.
because it makes you vulnerable to competitors who are using what he calls price-led costing.
Okay, what's price-led costing?
It's basically where you set your price based on what you think the market will accept, and then you figure out how to make your product at that price.
So it's kind of working backwards, right? Like you start with the price and then you figure out the product.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Drucker's saying that this can be a really powerful strategy, especially if you're a new entrant into a market.
Like you come in with a lower price and you undercut the established players.
Yeah. And he uses the example of the US machine tool industry, which was, for a long time it was dominated by American companies.
Right, like the heart of American manufacturing.
Yeah, but then, the Japanese companies, they come in with this price-led costing strategy, and they completely undercut the American companies.
And the American companies, they couldn't compete.
No, they couldn't. They were too focused on their margins, on maximizing profits in the short term.
And they paid the price in the long term.
Big time. And he also talks about the potential threat to German luxury car makers in the U.S. from Toyota and Nissan, which, back then that was kind of a new idea.
Right, like Toyota and Nissan were still seen as like, economy cars.
Yeah. But Drucker's saying that if they start using this price-led costing strategy,
Yeah.
they could really challenge the luxury brands.
Okay, so deadly sin number 1, don't be too greedy, don't be too focused on short-term profits. What's sin number 2?
Sin number 2 is killing off the product that enjoys rapid growth.
Okay, so what does that mean? Like, why would a company kill its own successful product?
Well, this is usually what happens when a company has a really successful established product, what he calls a cash cow.
Right, like it's generating a lot of revenue, a lot of profit.
Exactly. And then they come up with a new product, something that's growing really fast, but maybe it's not as profitable yet.
Right, so it's more of a long-term bet.
Yeah. And what happens is that the company gets so focused on protecting its cash cow that it ends up starving the new product.
Like they don't want to cannibalize their own sales.
Exactly. And Drucker uses IBM as an example of this, not once, but twice.
Okay, how so?
So the first time was back in the early days of computing when they first developed a computer.
Right, and they were still selling like those punch card machines, right?
Yeah, those were their cash cow. And apparently, top management at IBM, they deliberately limited the marketing of the computer because they didn't want to hurt the punch card business.
That's just crazy, right?
It is, right. But it makes sense from their perspective at the time. They're trying to protect their existing revenue stream.
And it almost killed them, right? I mean, if it wasn't for that antitrust suit that forced them to divest the punch card business, they might have completely missed the computer revolution.
Exactly. And then they do it again in the 80s with the PC.
Okay, so how did that play out?
Well, so they had this rapidly growing PC business, but they were also still selling mainframes, which were, still very profitable.
Right, and the PC division, they were kind of seen as a separate entity almost.
Yeah. And the mainframe division, they basically put pressure on the PC division not to sell to their customers.
Like they were worried about losing sales to the PC.
Exactly. And that ended up really hindering the growth of the PC business, and it gave an opening to competitors like Compaq and Dell.
Right, who were happy to sell PCs to anyone who wanted one.
Exactly. So Drucker's point is that you have to be really careful not to let your past successes blind you to the opportunities of the future.
Right. Like you got to be willing to let go of the old to make way for the new.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's a really tough thing for a lot of companies to do.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got 2 deadly sins down. What's number 3?
Number 3 is treating a product as a cash cow.
Okay. That sounds kind of similar to sin number 2.
Yeah. It is, yeah. I mean, they're definitely related, but sin number 2 is more about killing off a new product to protect an old one. Sin number 3 is more about just milking a product for all it's worth without without reinvesting in it.
Right, like you just keep squeezing it until there's nothing left.
Yeah. And that might work for a while, but eventually the product is going to become obsolete or the market is going to change, and then you're going to be left with nothing.
Right, like you're going to be left holding the bag.
Exactly.
Okay, so sins 2 and 3, they're kind of about this short-sightedness, this unwillingness to invest in the future.
Right. And to be honest, I think a lot of companies struggle with this. It's really hard to balance the short-term demands of Wall Street and shareholders with the long-term needs of the business.
Yeah, definitely. All right, what's deadly sin number 4?
Patching instead of innovating.
Okay, so we actually talked about this quite a bit when we were discussing the theory of the business, right?
We did, yeah. It's this idea that when your theory of the business is no longer working, you can't just keep, making little tweaks and adjustments.
Right, like you gotta be willing to go back to the drawing board and completely rethink things.
Exactly, and that's hard. It's much easier to just try to patch things up.
But it's a recipe for disaster in the long run.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so that leaves us with deadly sin number 5, which is...
feeding problems and starving opportunities.
Okay, explain that one.
So this is basically about how companies allocate their resources. And what Drucker's saying is that a lot of companies, they end up spending way too much time and money trying to fix problems, trying to turn around failing businesses.
Right, like they're throwing good money after bad.
Exactly. And at the same time, they're not investing enough in their opportunities, in their growth areas.
So they're basically starving the healthy parts of the business to try to prop up the sick parts.
Yeah. And that's a recipe for decline. He's basically saying that you have to be really ruthless about cutting your losses.
Right. Like don't be afraid to walk away from something that's not working.
Exactly. And then focus your resources on the areas where you have the biggest potential for growth.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Now, switching gears a little bit, let's talk about family businesses. I mean, this is a topic that's obviously near and dear to a lot of our listeners.
Yeah, for sure. And Drucker, he has a lot of really insightful things to say about the unique challenges and opportunities of family businesses.
Okay, so what are some of the big ones?
Well, I mean, the biggest one is probably the tension between the needs of the business and the needs of the family.
Right, like you've got the business side, which is all about, profits and growth, and then you've got the family side, which is all about, relationships and legacy.
Yeah, and those two things don't always align.
Definitely not. So how do you navigate that?
Well, Drucker's got some really specific advice. One of the things he talks about is the importance of bringing in professional non-family managers.
Okay, so like hiring outside help.
Exactly. He calls them inside outsiders. Like they're part of the company, but they're not part of the family.
And why is that so important?
Because it brings in objectivity. It brings in expertise that the family might not have.
Right, like you might have a family member who's really good at sales, but you might not have a family member who's really good at finance.
Exactly. And Drucker, he tells this great story about a big family-owned manufacturing company that brought in a non-family CFO.
And how'd that work out?
It was a huge success. The CFO, he brought in a lot of new ideas, new systems, and he really helped to professionalize the company.
So bringing in outside help can be really beneficial. What else does Drucker say about family businesses?
Well, he also talks about the dangers of nepotism.
Right. Like, giving jobs to family members just because they're family members.
Yeah. And he's not saying that you should never hire family members, but he's saying that you have to be really careful about it. You have to make sure that the family member is actually qualified for the job.
Right. Like you got to treat them like any other candidate.
Exactly. And you have to be willing to let them go if they're not performing.
Which can be really tough, right? I mean, it's family.
It is, yeah. But it's important for the health of the business.
Okay, so we've got, bring in outside help, be careful about nepotism. What else?
Well, the other big challenge that Drucker talks about is succession planning.
Right. Like who's going to take over the business when the current generation retires?
Exactly. And this can be a really tricky issue for family businesses.
Why is that?
Well, because there's often a lot of emotion involved. You've got siblings who might be vying for the top job. You've got parents who might be trying to hold on to control.
Right. It can get really messy.
It can, yeah. And Drucker, he tells some stories about family businesses that have been like completely torn apart by succession battles.
So what's the key to getting it right?
Well, Drucker's saying that the most important thing is to start planning early.
Right. Like don't wait until the last minute.
Exactly. And to be really clear about the criteria for choosing a successor.
Right. Like what are the skills, what are the qualities that are most important?
Yeah, and then to have a process in place for making the decision.
So it's all about like being proactive and being transparent.
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked about the theory of the business, planning for uncertainty, the deadly business sins, and managing family businesses. Now let's move on to leadership. And Drucker, he's got these 6 rules for presidents, which, as you said earlier, they're really applicable to leaders at any level.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are just like timeless principles of effective leadership.
Okay, so rule number 1.
Rule number 1 is set priorities.
Okay, so what does that mean? Like just make a to-do list.
Well, it's more than that. It's about identifying the 1 or 2 things that are absolutely critical to the success of your organization, and then focusing all your energy on those.
Right, like don't try to do too much at once.
Exactly. And Drucker uses the example of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, when he came into office, the country was in the middle of the Great Depression.
Right, like it was a huge mess.
Massive. And Roosevelt, he could have tried to tackle, 100 different problems at once.
Right, like try to be all things to all people.
Yeah, but he didn't. He focused on a few key priorities, like getting people back to work and reforming the banking system.
And that focus, I mean, it obviously paid off.
Yeah. And Drucker's point is that for any leader, it's absolutely essential to be able to focus on the most important things.
Right. Don't get bogged down in the minutia.
Exactly.
Okay, rule number 2.
Don't have too many helpers.
Okay, so this is kind of counterintuitive, right? Like you would think that the more help you have, the better.
Yeah, but Drucker's saying that having too many direct reports can actually be really inefficient.
How so?
Well, because it just creates a lot of complexity, a lot of communication overhead.
Right, like you're constantly having to check in with everyone to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Yeah. And it also makes it harder to hold people accountable.
Right, like if everyone's responsible for something, then no one's really responsible for anything.
Exactly.
Okay, rule number 3.
Build a strong, independent staff.
Okay, so what does that mean? Like hire people who are smarter than you.
Well, it's more than that. It's about hiring people who are not afraid to challenge you, who are not afraid to tell you when they think you're wrong.
Right, like you don't want a bunch of yes men.
Exactly. You want people who are gonna push you, who are gonna make you think.
And Drucker, he quotes Lincoln on this, right?
Yeah, he quotes Lincoln's famous line about not having friends in his administration.
Okay, so Lincoln, he was all about like surrounding himself with people who would tell him the truth, even if it wasn't what he wanted to hear.
Exactly. And Drucker also talks about Theodore Roosevelt, who, he was very social, he had lots of friends.
Like the life of the party?
Yeah. But he deliberately kept his closest friends outside of his official circle of advisors.
So he could get their honest opinions without any strings attached.
Right.
Okay, rule number 4.
Make sure you have one person who speaks for you.
Okay, so this is about like having a designated spokesperson.
Yeah. It's about having someone who can clearly and consistently communicate your vision, your priorities, your decisions.
Right. So it's all about like having a unified message.
Exactly. And this is especially important in large organizations where there are lots of different stakeholders, lots of different constituencies.
Right. Like you don't want everyone going off in different directions.
Exactly.
Okay, rule number 5.
Get out of the office.
Okay. That sounds pretty straightforward. Like, take a break, go for a walk.
Well, it's more than that. It's about staying connected with the realities of your organization, with the people who are actually doing the work.
Right. Like don't just sit in your ivory tower and make decisions based on spreadsheets and reports.
Exactly. You gotta get out there, you gotta talk to people, you gotta see what's actually happening.
And Drucker, he says that this is especially important for leaders who have been in their jobs for a long time.
Yeah, because it's easy to get complacent, to get out of touch.
Right. Like you start to believe your own hype.
Exactly.
Okay, and finally, rule number 6.
read.
Okay, so this is about, like, staying informed.
Yeah. It's about continuous learning, about being curious, about being open to new ideas.
Right, like don't just rely on your existing knowledge.
Exactly. And Drucker's saying that this is especially important in a time of great change because the world is changing so fast that what you knew yesterday might not be relevant today.
Right, like you gotta constantly be updating your mental models.
Exactly.
Okay, so those are Drucker's 6 rules for presidents, which, I think are really applicable to any leader.
Yeah, for sure. And they're all about